All right, so picture this. You just chilling on your couch, maybe with a coffee or something, and you cast your vote in the election just like that on your phone. A few taps, no lines, no hassle.
Yep.
Sounds pretty convenient, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to something as important as voting, convenience can't be the only thing we're thinking about, right?
Yeah.
We need to be able to trust the system. And that's where things get really interesting, because today we're going to do a deep dive in online voting and how UX design, the look and feel of those voting platforms can either build trust or completely destroy it. We've got some fascinating stuff to cover today, and we're going to be pulling some insights from this political scientist who's become a bit of a UX expert. So when you hear like digital trust, what's the first thing that pops into your head, especially when we're talking about elections and stuff?
Confidence, I think. It's about, that certainty that your vote is going exactly where it's supposed to be going, that it's being counted the right way, and that the whole system is secure and can't be, manipulated.
Okay, so digital trust is like the foundation of the whole online voting thing. But how does UX design, like how a website or an app looks and feels, actually build that trust? I mean, it's not like just because something has a good design, it's automatically secure. Right.
Yeah, good design doesn't automatically equal good security, but it can communicate it well. Take Estonia, for example. They've been doing e-voting since 2005, and more than 40% of their votes are cast online. One of the reasons their system is so successful is this really cool feature they have. It's called a calendar receipt. So after someone votes, they can actually see their vote marked on a calendar on the election date. It's visual proof, that their vote was registered. And that kind of clever design, that goes a long way in building trust.
It's like a digital I voted sticker. Love that. But let's flip the script for a second. Could like a really strong focus on having a smooth, user-friendly experience actually mask potential security flaws? Could good UX in a way almost make people too trusting?
That's a great question. And it highlights a really important challenge. You're totally right. A really nice interface can create a false sense of security if the systems behind it aren't actually good. It's kind of like putting a nice facade on a house with a bad foundation. It might look great, but it's not actually secure. And that's where the responsibility of the designers and developers comes in. They have to make sure that the user experience, matches the actual security of the system. Transparency is key.
So how do we find that balance? How do you design a system that's both really easy to use and undeniably secure? Like a system where those two things actually work together.
Well, one way is to think about how we experience security in the physical world. Like when you go to a bank, you see security guards, cameras, vaults. Those things make you feel like your money is protected, right? We need those same kind of cues online. They just have to be digital.
Interesting. So like translating those real-world security things into the digital space.
Exactly. Think about like progress bars that show the status of your vote being submitted and verified, or verification codes sent to your email or phone, or even like a digital receipt after you vote that confirms your vote was recorded. These elements, they might seem simple, but they actually provide a lot of reassurance to the user and increase their trust in the system. They show that security is being taken seriously.
Okay, so now that we've talked about how important this digital trust is, let's dig into some of the specific UX challenges that are unique to online voting.
Well,
What are some of the hurdles that designers face when they're creating these platforms?
accessibility is a big one, making sure the system can be used by everyone, no matter their age, their technical skills, or if they have disabilities. If the design excludes even a small group of people, then it undermines the whole point of democratic participation.
That's a good point about making sure digital systems are equitable. So how do designers walk that line, making sure that a system is accessible to everyone, but also super secure?
It's definitely a balancing act, and there's no one perfect solution. But one approach is to get input from a diverse group of users right from the start. Do testing with people of different ages, technical abilities, and disabilities. This can help identify any accessibility issues early on, which leads to a more inclusive design.
That makes sense. Involving the people who will actually be using the system. What other challenges are there when designing UX for online voting?
Another big one is the perception of security, especially for people who aren't very tech savvy. Even if you have strong encryption and security protocols, a glitchy interface or a lack of clear confirmation messages can make people not trust the system. It's like that feeling you get when your online banking app freezes right before you submit a payment. Even if you know the app is secure, that little glitch can make you question everything.
Oh yeah, I've totally been there. That moment of doubt.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we've seen real-world examples of how this can play out with online voting. Remember the Iowa caucus app in 2020? Technical problems and poorly designed user interface caused a lot of chaos and delays, and it led to people being really skeptical of the results.
That was a big wake-up call about how important it is to get UX right in these situations. So how do you design a system that makes people feel like their vote is secure, even if they don't understand all the technical stuff happening behind the scenes? Let's be real, most of us aren't cybersecurity experts.
Yeah, you're right. And that's where good UX design is so important. It bridges the gap between that complex technology and what the user understands. We have to make security visible and understandable, even for people who don't know a lot about encryption and firewalls.
Okay, I'm listening. How do we actually do that? How do you make security something that people can see and understand instead of it just being this abstract concept?
Well, think about those progress bars you see when you download a file. They show you how far along the download is. We can do the same thing with online voting. Imagine a progress bar that shows each step of the process. Your vote being encrypted, transmitted, verified, and then finally recorded.
So instead of just hoping that my vote is being handled securely, I could actually see it happening.
Yeah.
That makes sense. What are some other ways to make security more tangible in the online voting experience?
Verification codes are another good example. After you cast your vote, you could get a unique code through email or text. Entering that code would be another layer of confirmation that your vote was received and linked to you. It's simple, but effective for boosting confidence.
Like a digital handshake. You mentioned blockchain earlier. Could you explain how that immutable ledger thing could help with concerns about vote tampering?
Yeah, you're on the right track. Blockchain creates a permanent record of every transaction that can't be changed. So with online voting, once your vote is on the blockchain, it's pretty much impossible to tamper with it. Each vote is like a tiny block added to a chain, and that chain is constantly being watched by a huge network of computers.
So it's like having millions of digital eyes making sure everything is legit. That's reassuring, especially now when people are so concerned about election integrity. But isn't blockchain technology pretty complicated? Would the average person even understand how it works, let alone trust it?
That's a valid point. The technology might be complex, but the user experience doesn't have to be. That's where UX design comes in again. Designers have to figure out how to explain the benefits of blockchain in a way that's easy to understand and doesn't use a bunch of technical jargon.
So instead of talking about hash functions and stuff, we need to make it relatable.
Exactly. We need to turn that complexity into an experience that feels simple and trustworthy. Imagine a voting interface that uses visuals to show people how their vote is being protected by blockchain. Maybe an animation of your vote being added to a chain, or a visual representation of how each block is linked to the one before it to create an unbreakable chain.
That would make the idea of immutability much easier to grasp. Speaking of making things concrete, are there any real-world examples of online voting systems that are doing a good job of balancing security and user-friendliness?
Switzerland is a good example. They've been experimenting with UX-focused online voting systems for a while now, and they're always improving their designs.
What makes their approach different?
They're really focused on the whole voter experience, from registration to casting their ballot to getting confirmation that their vote was counted. They even have features that let people verify that their vote was recorded correctly without compromising the secrecy of their ballot.
So they're thinking about every step of the process and addressing any anxieties people might have.
Exactly. That attention to detail is really important for building trust. They're also really transparent about their security, explaining it in plain language how the system works and what they do to prevent fraud.
That transparency is so important, given how much misinformation and distrust there is around online voting. It's one thing to have a secure system, but if people don't understand how it works, they won't trust it.
Exactly. Trust is built on understanding. That's why security experts and UX designers need to work together.
All right, so we've talked about digital trust, the challenges of designing UX for online voting, and some innovative solutions. But what does all this mean for the future of voting? Are we headed towards a world where we all vote from our smartphones?
It's definitely possible. Online voting has the potential to make voting more accessible and convenient and secure. But it's important to remember it's not a perfect solution. There are still challenges and concerns.
Like what? What are some of the potential downsides or risks we need to be aware of?
Well, one concern is that it could make the digital divide even worse. If we're not careful, online voting could leave out people who don't have reliable internet access or who aren't comfortable using technology. We need to make sure that if we move towards online voting, we're also working hard to bridge the digital divide and make digital literacy a basic right.
That's an important point. We can't let online voting become another thing that gives an advantage to people who already have more resources. Are there any other potential problems we should be thinking about?
Security will always be a top priority. Even though technology is always evolving, so are the ways that people try to exploit it. We always need to be developing and implementing systems that are resistant to cyber attacks and can adapt to new threats. And we need to be honest about the limits of these systems, knowing that no technology is perfect.
So we can't get complacent, even as we embrace the possibilities of online voting. Are there any other concerns that you think about when it comes to the future of voting in this digital age?
One thing that worries me is the possibility of manipulating voters through UX design itself. We talked about how good design builds trust, but what if those design principles are used for bad reasons?
Oh, wow. You mean that online voting systems could be designed to subtly push people towards certain choices without them even knowing it?
It's something we have to consider. We know that design can influence our behavior even in small ways. Think about how social media platforms keep you scrolling or how e-commerce sites try to get you to buy more stuff. Could those same ideas be used to influence voters? It's a question we need to be asking ourselves.
It's like those dark patterns, but applied to democracy. Sneaky design tricks to get us to do things we wouldn't normally do. It's scary to think that something as important as our vote could be manipulated through design.
It is a serious thought. And it shows how important it is for voters to be careful and think critically. We have to be aware of how design can influence us, even in something like online voting.
So how do we protect ourselves? How do we become smarter about these online voting platforms and learn how to tell the difference between a system that's truly designed to help us and one that might be trying to manipulate us?
Education is key. We need to be talking about these issues openly and honestly, raising awareness about the potential for design to be used for good or bad. We need to give voters the critical thinking skills they need to evaluate online voting platforms, to look beyond the surface and think about the reasons behind the design choices.
So it's not just about knowing how to use the platform, it's about understanding the forces behind it.
Exactly.
That's a lot to ask of the average voter.
It is, but it's something we can't ignore. The future of our democracies might depend on our ability to use technology in a way that's critical and informed. We can't just assume that anything called online voting is good or trustworthy. We need to be just as careful and discerning with voting as we are with other things in our digital lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into online voting and UX design, it seems like we have more questions than answers. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe these are the questions we should be asking ourselves as we figure out this complex and changing landscape.
I agree. We can't be complacent, especially when it comes to our right to vote. We need to be curious and skeptical and demand more from the technologies that shape our democracies.
Well, we've covered a lot today. The relationship between online voting, UX design, and the future of our democracies. This is a conversation that will probably keep going for a long time. And it's one that we all need to pay attention to and be a part of. As you think about online voting, consider this. Do you think there should be rules about how these systems look and feel to prevent manipulation through UX design? And if so, who should be in charge of creating and enforcing those rules? It's a question that makes us think about the connections between technology, ethics, and the very foundation of our democracy. Thanks for joining us on this exploration, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp as we figure out the future of voting together.
Like those progress bars you see like when you're downloading something, they give you a visual, like how much has been downloaded. We could use that same idea for online voting. Like picture a progress bar that shows each step, encrypting the vote, transmitting it, verifying it, and then finally recording it.
Oh, so instead of just trusting that it's being done securely, I could actually see it. That makes sense. What are some other ways to make security more tangible in the online voting experience?
Verification codes are a good example. So like after you vote, you could get a code sent to your email or your phone. And then entering that code would be like another layer of confirmation, showing that your vote was received and that it's linked to your identity.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple, but it's effective for, making people feel more confident.
Yeah, like a digital handshake. You mentioned blockchain a little bit earlier. Could you explain how that immutable ledger thing could help with concerns about vote tampering?
Yeah, so the great thing about blockchain is that it creates a permanent record of every transaction. It can't be changed. So with online voting, once your vote is recorded on the blockchain, it's practically impossible to mess with it. Each vote is like a little block that's added to this chain, and that chain is constantly being checked by tons of computers.
So it's like having millions of eyes watching over everything.
Yeah.
That does sound reassuring, especially with all the concerns about election integrity these days. But isn't blockchain technology pretty complicated? Would the average person even understand how it works, let alone trust it?
Yeah, you're right. The technology itself might be complex, but the experience for the user doesn't have to be. That's where good UX design is really important. Designers need to find a way to explain the benefits of blockchain in a clear way, without overwhelming people with all the technical terms.
So instead of throwing around words like hash functions and whatever,
Exactly. We need to translate that complexity into something that feels simple and trustworthy. Like, imagine if the voting interface used visuals to show people how their vote is protected by the blockchain. Maybe there's a little animation of your vote being added to a chain, or a visual representation of how each block is linked together to create this unbreakable chain.
I think those visuals would really help people understand the concept. Speaking of concrete examples, are there any countries or organizations that are doing a good job with this? Like integrating UX and online voting in a secure and user-friendly way?
Switzerland's doing some interesting things. They've been testing out these UX-focused online voting systems for a few years now, and they're constantly improving their designs.
What's so special about their approach?
Well, they're really committed to the whole user experience. They think about every single step the voter goes through, from registering to casting their vote to receiving confirmation that their vote was counted. They even have features that allow voters to verify that their vote was recorded correctly. But it doesn't compromise the secrecy of their ballot.
So they're not just focused on making it easy to vote online, they're also thinking about all the little concerns and worries people might have along the way.
Exactly. And paying attention to those details is really important for building trust. They're also very transparent about their security protocols. They explain in plain language, how the system works and what measures are in place to prevent fraud.
That transparency is so important, especially with all the misinformation and distrust around online voting. It's one thing to have a secure system, but if people don't get it, they won't trust it.
Right. Trust comes from understanding. And that's where the collaboration between security experts and UX designers is really important.
Okay, so we've talked about digital trust and the specific challenges of designing UX for online voting and some really innovative solutions. But where does this leave us when we think about the future of voting? Are we all going to be casting our ballots from our smartphones someday?
It could happen. Online voting has so much potential, to make voting easier, more convenient, more secure. But it's important to remember that it's not a perfect solution. There are still some hurdles we have to overcome and some legitimate concerns to address.
Like what kind of concerns? What are some of the potential downsides we need to be aware of as we move in this direction?
Well, one concern is that it could worsen the digital divide. If we're not careful, online voting could exclude people who don't have reliable internet access or the skills to navigate technology. We need to make sure that any move toward online voting is paired with real effort to bridge that digital divide and make digital literacy a basic.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
We can't let online voting become another thing that disadvantages people who already face barriers. What other potential problems are there?
Security will always be a top concern, right? As technology keeps getting better, the ways people try to exploit it also get better. So we always have to be developing and using systems that can resist cyber attacks and adapt to new threats. And we have to be upfront about the limitations of any system, because no technology is perfect.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is still important, even as we get excited about all the possibilities.
Yeah.
Are there any other concerns that you think about when it comes to the future of voting in this digital age?
One thing that I think about is the possibility of manipulating voters through the UX design itself. We've talked about how good design builds trust, but what happens when those same principles are used for bad purposes?
That's a scary thought. Are you saying that online voting systems could be designed to subtly push voters towards certain choices
Yeah.
without them even realizing it?
Yeah, it's a possibility we have to think about. We know that design can influence our behavior, even in subtle ways. Like, think about social media platforms and how they're designed to keep you scrolling and scrolling, or how e-commerce sites use design to get you to add more things to your cart. Could those same principles be used to influence voters? It's definitely something to consider.
It's like those dark patterns, but for democracy. Those sneaky design tricks that take advantage of how our brains work to get us to do things we might not normally do.
Yeah.
It's kind of unsettling to think that something as fundamental as our vote could be vulnerable to that kind of manipulation.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, and it really highlights why it's so important for voters to be vigilant and to think critically. We need to be aware of how design can influence our choices, even in something like online voting, which seems pretty straightforward.
Okay, so how do we protect ourselves?
Yeah.
How do we become more aware of these things and, tell the difference between a system that's genuinely trying to help us and one that might be trying to, steer us in a certain direction?
I think education is key. We need to be talking about these issues more openly and raising awareness about how design can be used for good or for bad. We need to give voters the critical thinking skills to really evaluate these platforms, to look beyond the surface and, think about the motivations behind the design choices.
So it's not just about knowing how to use the system. It's about understanding the forces that shaped it.
Exactly.
That's a lot to ask of the average voter, though.
It is. But we can't ignore it. The future of our democracies might depend on us being able to use technology in a way that's both critical and informed. We can't just assume that every online voting system is automatically good or trustworthy. We need to apply the same level of scrutiny that we use in other parts of our digital lives.
So it sounds like as we wrap up this deep dive into online voting and UX design, we're left with more questions than answers. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe these are the questions we need to be asking ourselves as we try to figure out this complicated and ever-changing world.
I think so. Complacency is dangerous, especially when we're talking about something as important as our right to vote. We need to stay curious and skeptical, and we need to demand more from the technologies that shape our democracies.
So listener name, we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring how online voting, UX design, and the future of democracy are all connected. It's a conversation that's going to keep going for a long time, and we all need to be a part of it. As you think about all this, consider this. Do you think there should be rules about how these online voting systems look and feel? To prevent them from being manipulated through design? And if so, who should make those rules and enforce them? It's a question that makes us think about how technology ethics and the very core of our democracy all intersect. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and don't forget to keep those critical thinking skills sharp as we navigate the future of voting together.